is a little pocket of these 4 valleys, and I went all over them documenting these pyramids. They don't look like pyramids anymore. They look like mounds. They're so old. But there's another place 200 kilometers north in the Chasma Valley, and what they have found is underneath the structures that are currently exposed,
high above the modern city of Cusco, where the Andes rise into thin, cold air nearly 12,000 feet above sea level, there is a wall that seems to challenge the limits of what we think ancient builders were capable of. It is not impossible because it is beautiful, although it is. It is not impossible because it is ancient, although it is ancient enough to have watched centuries pass beneath the mountain winds. It is impossible because of what had to happen before those stones could ever become a wall. Imagine standing beneath blocks as large as automobiles, some of them weighing more than 100 tons, and then imagine that those same blocks were somehow transported across the brutal terrain of the Andes, lifted into position, shaped, adjusted, and locked together with such extraordinary precision that in many places there is barely enough space to slip even a sheet of paper between them. There is no mortar holding them together, no cement filling the seams, no modern adhesive creating the illusion of strength. Just enormous pieces of stone pressed against one another, their strange surfaces interlocking so tightly that the wall appears less like something assembled and more like something that somehow grew out of the mountain itself. And before we go any further, please subscribe to our channel and help us reach our goal of 5,000 subscribers. For centuries, travelers, historians, engineers, and archaeologists have stood before these walls and eventually arrived at the same question. How? How were stones of this size cut? How were they moved up a mountain where even walking can leave your lungs burning? How were they lifted and positioned with enough control to make irregular surfaces meet so perfectly? And how could a civilization without modern cranes, steel tools, engines, or heavy machinery repeatedly accomplish something that would still be a serious engineering challenge today? Now, a new kind of investigation has added another layer to the mystery. Instead of simply looking at the walls, researchers began measuring them in extraordinary detail, feeding their geometry into artificial intelligence and allowing algorithms to examine relationships between joints, angles, curves, surfaces, and hidden patterns that the human eye could never realistically track. Millions of measurements, mapped down to the millimeter, were turned into data. And when the machine began comparing those measurements, the results did not fit as neatly into the traditional story as many might have expected. To understand why that matters, you have to leave the theories behind for a moment and imagine yourself actually standing on the mountain. The place is known as Sacsayhuaman, a monumental complex overlooking Cusco from a high ridge above the ancient Inca capital. The altitude changes everything. The air feels thinner. The wind moves sharply across the stone terraces. The landscape stretches outward in every direction, and against that enormous Andean backdrop, the walls appear almost unreal. 3 massive defensive terraces run across the ridge in a dramatic zigzag pattern, extending for hundreds of meters. From a distance, the geometry resembles the teeth of an enormous saw, cutting back and forth across the mountainside. But distance hides the most astonishing part. Walk closer, and the scale begins to overwhelm you. A block that looked merely large from far away suddenly rises above your head. Some stones are enormous enough to make a modern construction vehicle look small beside them. The largest blocks are estimated to weigh more than 120 tons, a mass so extreme that it is difficult to visualize. Think of the weight of a blue whale, one of the largest animals ever to exist, and imagine that same mass transformed into a single piece of granite, transported across rugged terrain and somehow positioned within a wall on a mountain. Yet even the weight is not the strangest part. What truly catches the attention of engineers is the shape. These stones are not simple cubes. They are not standardized rectangular blocks designed to be stacked quickly and efficiently. Each one seems to have been given its own personality. One surface angles inward while another projects outward. A rounded shoulder appears beside a sharp corner. A knob protrudes from one side, while a neighboring stone contains a matching recess. Some faces curve gently, others meet at unusual angles, and yet the stones lock together as though someone had designed them as pieces of a three-dimensional puzzle. A protrusion on one block disappears into a hollow on another. A bulging face meets a carefully shaped depression. The result is a wall in which thousands of individual pieces, each with its own geometry, somehow cooperate as one enormous structure. And once you stand close enough to run your fingers across the seams, the effect becomes even stranger. In places, the boundary between two stones almost disappears beneath your fingertips. There is no thick line of mortar announcing where one block ends and another begins. There is simply stone meeting stone, fitted with a precision that continues to fascinate anyone who sees it. For generations, the accepted explanation has been considerably less mysterious, and it is important to present that explanation fairly before questioning it. Mainstream archaeology attributes the construction of Sacsayhuaman to the Inca, a civilization whose achievements were extraordinary even without the mystery surrounding these walls. The Inca created an enormous road network across some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. They transformed steep mountain slopes into agricultural terraces. They engineered water systems, built settlements at astonishing elevations, and developed a highly organized society capable of coordinating enormous amounts of labor. According to the conventional explanation, their monumental stonework was the result of skilled craftsmanship combined with time, organization, and relentless labor. Inca stoneworkers could use harder stones as hammer stones, repeatedly striking softer surfaces of granite to remove material a little at a time. They could chip away unwanted areas, grind surfaces using abrasive materials, test the fit, remove the stone again, adjust it, and repeat the process until the desired shape was achieved. And the technological limitations are part of what makes the achievement so impressive. There was no modern steel machinery waiting beside the quarry, no hydraulic crane capable of lifting a 100-ton block, no diesel engine, no industrial diamond saw, no fleet of heavy trucks carrying stone up a paved mountain road. There were ropes, timber, stone tools, human hands, and something perhaps even more important than any individual tool: organization. Thousands of people could be coordinated to quarry, transport, shape, and position enormous stones over long periods of time. In that sense, the traditional explanation does not depend on magic. It depends on labor, skill, persistence, and generations of accumulated knowledge. The basic idea is remarkably simple. Take a harder stone, strike a softer one, remove a tiny amount of material, and repeat the process thousands upon thousands of times. Eventually, the desired surface begins to emerge. At high altitude, your toolkit becomes almost painfully primitive. Stone against stone, muscle against granite, patience against time. And for a long time, that explanation seemed sufficient. After all, human beings are capable of extraordinary things when enough people work together for long enough. We know that ancient societies could accomplish enormous construction projects without modern machinery. We know that stone can be shaped with surprisingly simple tools. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that a harder stone can gradually abrade and fracture another stone, creating flat surfaces and removing substantial amounts of material through repeated work. So, at first glance, there is nothing inherently impossible about saying that ancient workers shaped granite with stone tools. The problem begins when we stop looking at one surface and start looking at the entire system. Patience can explain time. It can explain endurance. It can explain how a worker might spend hours, days, or even weeks gradually reducing a stone to the shape required. But patience alone does not explain complexity. It does not explain why thousands of enormous blocks have such individually complicated geometries. It does not explain how a worker knew exactly where to remove material from one stone so that it would meet another stone at a precise angle. It does not explain how the fit was repeatedly tested, adjusted, and reproduced across an entire monumental structure. A single flat face is one problem. A three-dimensional interlocking block is another problem entirely. And when that problem is repeated not once, but thousands of times, the question changes. We are no longer simply asking whether ancient people could shape stone. Clearly, they could. We are asking whether the traditional picture fully explains the method by which they achieved this extraordinary level of consistency. Because the closer you examine the walls, the more the mystery shifts away from the question of whether ancient people were capable of hard work and toward a much more interesting question. What system of knowledge allowed them to turn that hard work into such precise, repeatable results? What patience does not explain is complexity. These walls are not simply collections of flat faces stacked one above another. They are enormous three-dimensional systems, built from thousands of irregular stones, each one carrying its own strange geometry, each one different from the stone beside it, and yet each one fitting into its neighbors with a precision that seems almost impossible when you consider the tools available to the people who built them. And this is where the simple explanation begins to strain. Because the question is no longer whether someone could spend enough time hitting a piece of granite with another piece of stone. Of course they could. The real question is how that process could be controlled so precisely, repeated across thousands of blocks, and organized into a structure where every irregular piece somehow knows exactly where it belongs. The moment you look at the wall that way, the problem becomes much larger than stone cutting. It becomes a problem of engineering, planning, measurement, and accumulated knowledge. Think about how humans normally solve a construction problem of this scale. When you need to build something enormous from thousands of individual pieces, you simplify the pieces. You standardize them. You make identical bricks, identical blocks, identical beams, identical components, because repetition is efficiency. If 10 pieces are going into the same structure, you do not normally invent 10 completely different shapes and then spend hours figuring out how each one fits. You make them similar. You make them predictable. You create a system that allows one worker to repeat what another worker has already done. That is how construction becomes scalable. Sameness is faster. Sameness is easier to measure. Sameness allows mistakes to be corrected without redesigning the entire structure. It is one of the most fundamental principles of construction, and civilizations around the world discovered it again and again. But the builders of Sacsayhuaman appear to have taken the opposite approach. Instead of simplifying the stones, they made them more complicated. Instead of creating thousands of identical pieces, they created thousands of unique ones. And then, somehow, they fitted those unique stones together with extraordinary precision. They chose the most complicated possible version of the problem and repeated it over and over again, apparently using tools that, by modern standards, seem remarkably basic. That is why the word patience can become misleading when it is used as the entire explanation. Listen carefully to what happens when someone says, "They simply had enough time." It sounds like an answer, but it quietly changes the question. The original question is about method. How was the stone shaped? How were the angles determined? How was the fit checked? How did the workers know where to remove material and where to stop? But instead of answering those questions, the explanation shifts toward character. They were patient. They were determined. They had enormous numbers of workers. They were willing to spend years doing something that modern people would consider impossible. And there is truth in that. Their endurance was extraordinary. Their organization was extraordinary. Their willingness to invest enormous amounts of labor into monumental construction deserves respect. But endurance is not a technique. Patience tells us that the work may have taken a long time. It does not tell us how a curved surface on a 100-ton block was made to meet the corresponding surface of another massive stone. It does not tell us how the angles were measured, how the contact points were identified, how the stones were repeatedly tested and adjusted, or how thousands of unique pieces could eventually form something that resembles the precision of engineered components. And that is exactly why the new analysis becomes so important. Instead of starting with the assumption that the traditional explanation must be correct, researchers decided to approach the wall from another direction. Stop telling the story for a moment. Stop interpreting what the builders must have done. Stop looking at the stones through centuries of inherited assumptions. Instead, measure the wall. Let the structure speak through its geometry. But how do you do that without bringing your own expectations into every measurement? The answer was to remove as much human judgment as possible from the first stage of observation. The team did not arrive at Sacsayhuaman carrying a theory that they desperately wanted to prove. They arrived with cameras, scanners, measuring equipment, and a deliberate refusal to interpret the evidence until the numbers had been collected. The goal was simple: capture the wall as completely as possible, record its geometry at a level of detail no human observer could reproduce, and then allow computational analysis to search for patterns hidden inside the data. The first stage began with high-resolution photography. Not a handful of photographs taken for documentation, but thousands upon thousands of images captured from different positions and different angles. The walls were photographed repeatedly, with overlapping images carefully collected so that individual frames could later be combined into a continuous, three-dimensional representation. The timing mattered as well. Early morning light, when shadows were softer and less likely to hide the true shape of a surface, helped reveal details that harsh sunlight could exaggerate or conceal. Every irregularity mattered. Every projection, every notch, every rounded shoulder, every seam where two stones met was recorded. A surface that might appear smooth to the naked eye became a field of tiny variations when viewed through high-resolution imaging. What looked like a single block from 10 meters away became an intricate geometric object when the photographs were combined. Then came the laser scanning. This is where the wall begins to transform from an ancient monument into something closer to a mathematical object. A laser scanner sweeps a beam across the surface of the stone and records the return of that signal. From those returns, the machine calculates precise positions in three-dimensional space. One point becomes thousands, thousands become millions, and eventually, the scanner produces what is known as a point cloud, a dense collection of coordinates describing the physical structure of the wall. It is not a photograph. It is not an artist's reconstruction. It is not an archaeologist's sketch. It is measurement stripped down to geometry. Where the stone bulges outward, the model records the bulge. Where one block meets another, the model records the contact line. Where there is a microscopic gap, the gap becomes measurable. Where there is no gap, the absence of that space becomes data. The wall is reduced to distances, angles, curves, surfaces, and relationships. And that changes the question completely. A human being can stand in front of Sacsayhuaman for an entire lifetime and still only experience it as a wall. We can appreciate its scale. We can admire the craftsmanship. We can run our fingers along the seams and marvel at how tightly the stones fit. But the human eye is not designed to compare thousands of geometric relationships simultaneously. It cannot remember the exact curvature of one block and compare it with the curvature of another block several terraces away. It cannot calculate the frequency of a particular angle across hundreds of stones. It cannot reliably determine whether tiny variations in thousands of joints fall within a random range or follow a consistent pattern. There are simply too many variables. Human perception is powerful, but it is selective. We see the whole. We notice the extraordinary. We focus on what catches our attention. A machine can do something very different. It can remember everything it has been given. That is where artificial intelligence enters the story. Once the structure had been converted into an enormous body of geometric data, algorithms could begin searching for relationships that were invisible to ordinary observation. The AI was not looking at the wall the way a tourist looks at it. It was not asking whether the wall was beautiful or impressive. It was not asking whether the builders were primitive or advanced. It was looking for mathematical relationships. It could compare angles across hundreds of stones. It could examine the curvature of surfaces. It could measure distances between contact points. It could identify repeated patterns and determine whether those patterns appeared randomly or with a frequency that suggested a deliberate process. In a sense, the wall became a language, and the AI was trying to read its grammar. A person looks at a wall and sees stone. The machine looks at the same wall and sees numbers. And the first major question was almost deceptively simple. The joints? Everyone already knew that the joints were tight. That is one of the first things anyone notices when they encounter these walls. Visitors have tested the seams with pieces of paper, fingertips, and sometimes even objects small enough to search for the slightest opening. But the AI was asking a different question. It was not asking whether the joints were tight. It was asking exactly how tight they were, where they were tightest, where they were slightly wider, and whether the same degree of precision appeared repeatedly across the structure. Instead of examining one famous block, the system could examine thousands of contact surfaces, stone against stone, seam after seam, and compare them all. The scale of the comparison was something no individual researcher could realistically perform by eye. And what emerged was not simply tightness, it was consistency. The same remarkable closeness appeared again and again across stones that were otherwise completely different. A relatively small block could display the same precision as one of the enormous stones weighing dozens of tons. A stone with 6 major faces could meet its neighbors with the same apparent control as a stone with 10 or 12 complex surfaces. A joint exposed directly to sunlight could show the same pattern as one hidden deep inside a shadowed corner. The location changed. The size changed. The shape changed. Yet the relationship between the stones continued to show a striking degree of regularity. Now stop and consider why that matters. If the entire process depended only on repeated manual fitting, lifting, lowering, grinding, testing, removing the stone again, adjusting it, and repeating the process, some variation would be expected. Human beings are not machines. A worker may remove slightly more material one day and slightly less the next. One stone may be easier to work than another. One crew may have more experience. Another may be tired after hours of labor. Weather, lighting, tools, stone quality, and countless other factors would introduce small differences into the final product. That variation is the natural fingerprint of handmade construction. You see it in almost everything humans create by hand. No matter how skilled the craftsman, tiny inconsistencies tend to remain. But the data appeared to tell a more complicated story. Instead of the expected scatter, the measurements suggested a level of repeatability that demanded a closer look. The precision was not simply present in a few famous stones that had been carefully polished for display. It appeared repeatedly across the structure. The result did not look like isolated moments of extraordinary luck. It looked like a process capable of producing extraordinary precision more than once. And that distinction is enormous. Because patience can explain why someone keeps working until the stone is finished. But patience alone cannot explain why the same level of precision keeps appearing across thousands of different stones. That requires something more. It requires a method, a repeatable procedure, a set of decisions that workers could apply again and again, producing results that remained remarkably consistent even as the stones themselves changed. And suddenly, the question is no longer whether the builders had enough patience. The question becomes far more interesting. What method did they know that we no longer fully understand? And that signature is where the story takes another unexpected turn. Because when a harder stone strikes granite, the impact does not simply remove material. It leaves evidence of the violence that created the surface. Each blow produces tiny fractures, shallow pits, chipped edges, and microscopic craters. Strike the same area again and again, and those marks begin to accumulate into a recognizable texture. Under a close scan, the surface starts to tell the story for you. It looks exactly like what it should look like, stone beaten into submission, one impact at a time. And in many places across these ancient walls, that is precisely what the analysis revealed. The machine found the pitted,